Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to see you again in today's news program. Here, we and you will share and interact with the latest news and hottest events that are of public interest. Details will be available shortly. On 23rd, after meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, US President Donald Trump made a new post on the social network Chiso. In the post, the U.S. leader affirmed that he believes Kyiv is in a position to fight and take back all the territory if the European Union, EU, and NATO continue to support. The White House owner argued that after more than 3 years, Russia has not been able to defeat Ukrainian forces and that Russia is in great economic trouble because of the conflict. Mr. Trump wrote, "After studying and understanding the military and economic situation of Ukraine and Russia and after witnessing the economic troubles that this war has caused for Russia, I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and take back all the original territory." He added that with time, patience, and financial support from Europe and especially NATO, restoring the original borders is absolutely a possibility. However, Mr. Trump did not announce any new financial or military aid package for Kyiv, but only affirmed that the US will continue to provide weapons to NATO so that the bloc can decide how to use them. These comments are considered a significant change in the U.S. leader's stance on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Since taking office earlier this year, Mr. Trump has repeatedly tried to mediate negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. Recently, he expressed frustration with the slow progress in resolving the conflict, although he still called Russia a powerful country and said that President Zelensky had no cards in his hand. In a peace proposal proposed by U.S. Special Envoy Steve Kopp to European officials in Paris in April this year, Washington drafted terms that would recognize Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea and accept de facto Russian control of Ukrainian territories controlled by Russia from 2022. However, Mr. Trump recently set a deadline for Russia-Ukraine peace talks. He warned that if Moscow did not make progress in negotiating an end to the conflict with the Kyiv, the U.S. would kill sanctions against Russia. He also said the fastest way to end the war would be for Europe to stop buying Russian energy. Meanwhile, Russia has stressed that its economy has been able to adapt to international sanctions. Russia's economy has recently shown signs of slowing down, compared to growth of 4.1% in 2023 and 4.3% in 2024. This year, the economy is still forecast to grow by 2.5% despite heavy sanctions from the West. However, Russian President Vladimir Putin has insisted that the Russian economy is far from falling into recession, citing record low unemployment. Russian Central Bank Governor Elvira Nabiullina has also dismissed rumors of a recession. Speaking at the Moscow Financial Forum last week, she said the economy has slowed but there is no recession. On the same day, speaking on NBC's Today Show, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said Ukraine must agree to a peace deal with Russia. He stressed that this is not something the U.S. can decide, but the two sides must find a compromise. The U.S. diplomat said it is not up to us to decide whether to end the war. Russia must stop fighting and Ukraine must agree to a peace deal. Rubio said ending the conflict remains a priority for the Trump administration when asked about Washington's reluctance to impose new sanctions on Russia. Rubio said the U.S. wants to remain a mediator in the conflict for as long as possible. In his speech at the United Nations the same day, Rubio stressed that the war in Ukraine cannot be ended by military means. He said it will end at the negotiating table, that's where it will end. The U.S. remains as committed as ever to a peaceful resolution to this dangerous conflict. He called on the Council, including Russia, to do everything in its power to end it. He stressed that the war must end and we have done everything we can and will continue to do everything we can to end it. He said there had been very generous offers to resolve the conflict, including a ceasefire on the current lines. The U.S. Secretary of State also noted that the war was not only stalemate but also showing signs of escalation. Citing alleged Russian aircraft and drones incursions into NATO airspace, for his part, speaking after a meeting with President Trump on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, Ukrainian President Zelensky reaffirmed that the U.S. would provide security guarantees to Ukraine after the conflict ended. However, he said Ukraine did not yet know all the details. "We don't have specifics yet. I don't know the written details, But the positive thing is that we will work together on some kind of agreement and some kind of drones and some kind of weapons that we need for security guarantees and that Ukraine needs immediately, he said. I'm not the President of the United States. I can't say that President Trump will do everything that we want or need. I don't know, but he has been positive about the topics that we discussed. In a recent interview with CBS News' Phaser Nation, French President Emmanuel Macron asserted that the EU only imports a very small amount of Russian energy, calling for a lecture on dependence from US President Donald Trump. He said this is no longer a factor. We have reduced our oil and gas consumption from Russia by more than 80%. Previously, US President Donald Trump has repeatedly called on European allies to stop buying Russian oil, while hinting that he may consider additional measures against Moscow. One proposal from the US side calls for additional tariffs of up to 100% on goods from China and India and other trade restrictions to cut off the flow of Russian energy and prevent the transfer of dual-use technology to Moscow. While the EU as a whole has significantly cut its imports of Russian energy since Russian President Vladimir Putin launched a military operation in Ukraine in early 2022, some EU member states remain heavily dependent on Russian energy. Slovakia and Hungary have said they will resist pressure from Trump to cut off Russian oil until the EU finds a sufficient alternative. The EU has already passed a ban on imports of refined petroleum products from Russian crude, which will come into effect next year. It is also discussing a ban on imports of Russian liquefied natural gas, LNG, from 2027. Asked whether he would support additional sanctions or tariffs on Russia, Mr. Macron said it was not up to him alone. Amid growing European talk of using frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine, Mr. Macron was cautious about Moscow. On frozen assets, we all take very seriously the need to comply with international rules, he told CBS News. You cannot seize the assets of the central bank even in a situation like this. Most of the roughly $300 billion in frozen Russian assets are in Europe. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen suggested this month that the money could be used to provide Ukraine with a reparations loan. In the case of NATO accusing the Russian MiG-31 fighter of violating Estonian airspace, a question has been raised: why was the Moscow fighter not shot down? Carlo Masala, professor at Bundeswehr University, said in an interview with the German newspaper Bild that a decade ago, Turkey demonstrated its capabilities when Russian fighters violated their airspace for a short time. The expert recalled that in the fall of 2015, a Turkish Air Force F-16C fighter shot down a frontline bomber X-24M that accidentally violated the country's airspace for just 17 seconds. Moscow did not respond to this unfriendly step by Ankara with military action. Professor Masala believes that this is the level of determination that all NATO countries should have. He cited the specific nature of the mission as one of the reasons why NATO did not sell out the MiG-31, explaining that NATO is currently only carrying out an observation mission over the Baltic states and not a defense function. That is, their role does not include attacking Russian aircraft, but only scrambling to simulate intercepts, establish visual contact and provide escort. NATO air forces do not patrol the airspace, they only scramble when something suspicious appears. So they cannot react within seconds. He further explained, what appeared on the radar was basically just a black dot and it was unclear whether it was a civilian or a sports plane. Only when the plane did not respond were NATO fighter jets deployed. They flew parallel to the Russian microphone and signaled the plane to leave the area. The professor is confident that the incident in the sky over Estonia is a higher level of escalation than the drone incident in the sky over Poland 11 days ago. And NATO's response will become clear in the near future. Meanwhile, former Estonian intelligence chief Erik Niles Karos pointed out another factor in his conversation with the bill. According to him, in order to react quickly, the governments or parliaments of countries must give their pilots permission to operate first. In this case, the consent of the Italian side was necessary because their fighter jets took off to intercept the Russian fighters. However, Mr. Karos believes this is completely unnecessary. He said there was no intention to. It's not clear what the first step is, but that doesn't mean we won't think about it next time. Mr. Karos hinted that next time they could take even tougher action. The CDU-CSU foreign policy expert Rujan added that Germany's leading political party has called for fighter jets violating NATO airspace to be shot down. He warned that the Kremlin power needs a clear stop signal. They must understand that any violation of the border will be met with military force, including shooting down Russian fighter jets on NATO territory. Only this will work. According to its military logic, Russia will continue to add fuel and fire. There have been airspace violations already, soon there will be individual strikes and then Russian soldiers will appear. Earlier, President Spetbavin directly called for Russian planes to be shot down if they violate NATO airspace. While Defense Minister Lva Sakhalin hinted that NATO countries have the right to perform action on February 22, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt confirmed that the U.S. administration had seen a letter sent by Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro earlier this month, rejecting Washington's drug-related accusations against Caracas and offering to negotiate directly with President Donald Trump. However, Ms. Leavitt rejected the Venezuelan leader's proposal, affirming that the White House has not changed its stance of not recognizing the Maduro government. The president has made it clear that he is ready to use all necessary measures to stop the flow of drugs from Venezuela to the United States, she said. The Venezuelan government released a letter from President Maduro to his U.S. counterpart a few days ago after the U.S. military raided a drug boat in the Caribbean. In the letter, Maduro called on President Trump to maintain peace and equal dialogue, citing U.S. Special Envoy Richard Green as a potential mediator. The Venezuelan president noted that Special Envoy Wino had participated in prisoner exchanges and deportation flights, affirming that this was proof that the dialogue channels between the two sides were still active. He declared Venezuela a drug-free country, emphasizing that only 5% of the drugs produced for neighboring Colombia were smuggled into Venezuelan territory and most of them were seized by local authorities.